listener production.
Hey, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you for this bonus episode of The Briefing. As we barrel towards the end of a big and busy year, it's natural that we might start taking stock of 2024. Was it a good year? A bad year? Where are we at as a global community as we head into 2025? Now, depending on your social lens, your economic lens, or your political lens, you might be harbouring some pretty strong opinions on the state of society and the world right now. A question you might be asking yourself is, have we all just become a bunch of psychopaths? Well, Jon Ronson has made a career talking to people living on the edge and unpacking what makes us normal and not. He's a British-American journalist, author and filmmaker. He's known for works including Them, Adventures with Extremists, The Men Who Stare at Goats and The Psychopath Test. And he's in the country right now to help Australians ask the question of ourselves, are you, me, we just a bunch of psychopaths? And if yes, what does that mean for the world as we go into 2025? Jon, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. When you're asked to answer the question, are we all psychopaths, what do you think people mean? What are they trying to find out?
To be a psychopath, you need to have 15 of 20 traits on a checklist called the PCLR psychopath checklist. So actually, when people say, are we all psychopaths? The answer to that is very much no. Statistically, 1 in 100 people is a psychopath, so 99 of us aren't. However, that figure rises to 4% of CEOs and business leaders. So we've decided as a society to reward psychopathy and make them our leaders, which I think is frankly a terrible idea.
Agreed. Do you think the world then is throwing the word psychopath around a little bit too much these days?
That happens a lot with different mental illnesses and mental disorders. It happens with psychopathy, it happens with narcissism, it happens with OCD. You know, these words are used casually. But actually, those three conditions that I just mentioned are all very serious conditions and very different, of course. I mean, OCD is like the opposite of psychopathy because psychopaths have no anxiety and people with OCD have too much anxiety. So, yeah, I personally don't love it when sort of serious terms are bandied around.
A lot has happened across the world since you released your book, The Psychopath Test, in 2011. Do you think that the global community has it all become more psychopathic, or does social media and the internet kind of amplify it? And kind of relating back to my second question there was, we're just kind of throwing it around too easily at the moment.
If we make the psychopath checklist and psychopathy two separate things for a minute, because the psychopath checklist is 20 traits, and it's actually really interesting. You know, to be a psychopath, you have to have 15 approximately of the 20 traits. But I'd say that certain traits on the psychopath checklist are now being widely encouraged on social media. So, for instance, the fact that ideology has become such a big deal in people's lives, including journalists' lives, that people care more about ideology than evidence and truth. I was actually talking to somebody this morning, I won't say who it was, but he said that he was working for a big journalist company who said that journalism should be about moral clarity. And that felt to me like the worst idea in the world. Journalism should not be about moral clarity. It should be about objectivity and evidence. Because when you make journalism about moral clarity, what that promotes is pathological lying, which is an item on the psychopath checklist, because when ideology is more important than facts, you're encouraging people to be liars. Another item on the checklist is lack of empathy. On social media, I think what people promote is a highly selective empathy. It's empathy for your group, but zero empathy for people outside of your group. So that's another form of lack of empathy. So yeah, I'd say that psychopathic traits are being encouraged more than I remember them to be honest.
Why are you so interested in psychopathy and extremism?
The thing that got me interested in psychopathy is the idea that I'm not saying this, but this is what was said to me many times, that psychopaths look human and act human, but they're more like another species. They're more like predatory animals than human beings. And that struck me as just an enormous thought, because as a humanist, that's like the opposite of how I think about people. So that was the thought that first got me interested in psychopathy. Like, is that really true? And then when I discovered the statistic that you're, 4 times more likely to have a psychopath as your boss than as your underling. Again, that seemed like an enormous thought. Like, psychopathy is the worst mental disorder of all the mental disorders, yet that's the one that we're encouraging.
You just mentioned before we have become obsessed with ideology and dividing people into camps. And what is normal doesn't seem to be easily agreed upon anymore. What do you think is normal or normality?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think very few of us are normal. And in fact, not being normal can be very good. I score on certain mental health checklists. And I think, my flaws and my abnormalities are what's given me a good career. It made me like a good writer. There's a line in the psychopath test where I say something like our compulsions and our unhappinesses as unfashionable as they were back then when I was writing the book. Those things are more fashionable now, but they're what leads us to do quite interesting things.
Do you think there are psychopaths walking around the community totally unaware of their behaviour and thinking that they themselves are just normal people?
I've often thought that there must be truth to that, because psychopaths don't have empathy. So they must find it very hard to empathise with people who do have empathy. And they must find it hard to believe that people do have empathy. I've never met a psychopath who said this, but I've heard stories of psychopaths basically saying, I don't believe that empathy exists. I think people just pretend to be empathetic because they're so solipsistic, they think that everybody's kind of like them. So those people probably wouldn't see themselves as psychopaths.
In a lot of ways, the global community is safer than it ever has been before, but lots of people talk about it feeling or being the opposite of that it's more dangerous, that we're in more danger than we ever have been before. Are we becoming more extreme? Or again, is this the social media effect where it's amplified and the things you read on a forum or a message board or a comment section, it's not a reflection of real life, but it feels like it is because it's an echo chamber?
Yeah. When you said that, I was reminded of that book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And his thesis is that we're living in the safest time in human history, because in the old days, people were just constantly beheading people and setting villages on fire. And, when I listen to my history podcast, it does seem that I'm amazed anybody lived past the age of 10 until now, what with all the murder and mayhem. So there probably is a factual argument that we're living in safer times than ever, but it doesn't feel that way. I've got to say, things certainly feel less safe than any other point in my lifetime, except for maybe in the 80s when everybody was scared that we were about to be in a nuclear war. So this idea that, are we mistaking social media for real life? I would say that things have got a little bit better in that regard. The days of punitively punishing people for some minor transgression, disproportionately punishing them, everybody leaping onto that person on Twitter and then just ruining them for moral sport. I wouldn't say it's over, but I'd say it happens a lot less because people are much less frightened now to kind of fight back. A babble of opposing voices is democracy, and that's what we want is democracy. So I think things have got a bit better, but at the same time, it is still a frightening place when you say the wrong thing, and there can still be really big consequences.
Should we hate social media for what it has become in our society and how it's impacted the global psyche?
I used to think that the net good of social media outdoes the net bad, but I don't know if I feel that way anymore. I think if X just shut down now, I think it would be good for the world, not bad for the world. Because it promotes, you go on X these days and the first thing you see is, videos of people being killed. People laugh at videos of people being hit by cars and killed. I was on X a couple of days ago, the first thing I saw. And, you try and filter those things out by going onto your following tab, which means you're not being fed stuff that you haven't asked for. But then it just mysteriously takes you back to that tab where you are being fed things that you don't ask for. And the first thing that I saw the other day was a video of a black person being beaten up by white people. And the caption was, effed around and found out. So it's just promoting violence, lack of empathy, laughing at violence. that aspect of Elon Musk, I mean, I'm very, I think it's great that he can land a rocket between two sticks. I have no criticism of that. But I think this aspect of Elon Musk is one of the worst things that's happened to culture, as long as I can remember. There's a couple of, let me caveat it by one thing though. He's introduced this thing called community notes, where the public become the people who decide what is and what isn't misinformation, because he thinks that misinformation bodies can be biased towards the left and against the right. And I think I agree with him on that. So there's some things that I do agree with him about. But by and large, I think he's just a disaster.
Well, someone who has Elon Musk's ear at the moment and vice versa is one Donald Trump. And I think that you can't ignore the impact of Trump and his approach, I suppose, to free speech and for people being able to stand up for what they believe in, whether it's good, bad or the other, has influenced how we talk in our communities and on social media, but also in person, and how politicians speak about those things as well. They seem emboldened to kind of push the envelope further than we've ever seen it pushed before, to use a Trumpism. Would you call Donald Trump, or Elon Musk for that matter, a psychopath? How many checks on the checklist do they get?
So Donald Trump, my book and my stage show too, which I'm doing in Australia and New Zealand this week, is in some ways a cautionary tale to not armchair diagnose people. However, Trump has been in our lives for a very long time now. And I think, we have more information about Trump than clinicians tend to have when they decide whether or not somebody's a psychopath. So I don't think it's completely wrong to speculate on what's going on inside Trump's head. So my question is then, what's going on underneath the surface with Trump? Is there like a volcano of emotions that he can't handle, so he suppresses them and lashes out? If so, he's a narcissist. Or is what's going on underneath the surface nothing? He's like an empty shell. And if so, he's a psychopath. My guess, if it's one of those two things, is he's more likely to be a narcissist than a psychopath. He seems like a very emotional man.
Yeah. To finish up, Jon, the work you do and the conversations you have can be pretty intense and pretty heavy. I mean, this conversation has spanned lots of different ideas and some of them aren't so happy. But does being exposed to these ideas and you promoting it through your work, does it make you more or less hopeful about the future that we have to look forward to as a society?
Lately, I've been a little bit less hopeful, but with the new Trump presidency, I've decided personally, just on a very personal level, I've decided to take a different approach to last time. Last time, I was just horrified and on constant high alert. And I wasted 4 years of my life watching Anderson Cooper every night and getting more and more worried. And, I used to joke that, my QAnon was CNN and my Q was Anderson Cooper. I was just sort of listening and believing everything that he said. And now I look back on that with some regret. I think personally speaking, I wasted time. I could have maybe written another book instead of sitting there watching CNN every night and getting worried. And also, I think we were getting a very biased reflection of American life, because the fact is Trump almost won a second term. And you would never have thought that would happen from watching CNN for 4 years. You'd have thought it was a terrible mistake and he was going to lose in a landslide. Mm. And now he has won a second term. And this time around, until something terrible happens, I think I'm going to be a little less engaged and a little less kind of emotional and dramatic about it. And I'm just going to sort of quietly wait and see what happens. I think it's not just me. I think there's a lot of people who feel that way. I think a lot of people regret how much intensity they put into the first Trump presidency.
It's an interesting message. I mean, the work that you and I do involves people being engaged in the world around them, but maybe for their own goods, it involves stepping away for a little bit and focusing on the things that we can control.
I kind of think so. After Trump got elected the first time, as we know, there was a huge uptick in people subscribing to the New York Times and the Washington Post and, subscribing to every Trump-related podcast around. And I don't think that's happening this time. I think, I'm not saying that people are like completely disengaging and just walking around like sheeple with their heads in the cloud. But I think people are being a little bit more sort of balanced about it now. I mean, I personally didn't listen to any podcasts for the first 4 or 5 days after the election, because I just thought, you know what, I just need a bit of a break from all of this. I'm not necessarily saying that anything I've just said is good. Like, I'm not saying I'm advocating anything that I just said. It's just the way I'm personally feeling right now.
Jon Ronson, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your very interesting ideas with us. Thank you so much.
That was my pleasure. Thank you, Sacha.
That was Jon Ronson, journalist and author, speaking with me there. And if you're keen to see him in the flesh, details for his tour around Australia are in the show notes. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. We would love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We are on TikTok and YouTube as well. Search Listener Newsroom. And a reminder, tomorrow, Antoinette Lattouf is back in your ears for the weekend briefing as she sits down for an intimate chat with Osher Gunsberg, where nothing is off limits.
You had a real problem and you were going to die. All right. It doesn't care what that looks like. It can look like cask wine. It can look like vodka. It can look like, crushing up, over the counter codeine, drugs and snorting. It doesn't matter. What matters is there was a realisation that things have gotten out of control. That's all that matters.
Keep an eye out for that one. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.